Hi, this is Sarah Rummins. That's going to happen. I apologize for that. That's why this is take 3, because cats keep running across my table. So for my environmental dispute resolution, I'm going to be looking at the reintroduction of gray wolves into national forests, specifically in the Northwest. When I originally started research, I was going to focus strictly on Yellowstone and the conflict they've had. But as I did more research on the topic and looked further into it, there are a lot of connectors from other conflicts that form like an overarching web that has very similar stakeholders, very similar problems, very similar frameworks that they're using. So looking at it as a whole is fascinating to see that before you break it down into the smaller conflicts, so you can get a better idea of where the conflict really is. It's not necessarily local, it's usually state or federal that's setting the par for other conflicts. So that is why I chose that. It's very interesting to see the way some states work with federal, some states do not work with federal, and they're very large on pushing states' rights. Specifically for the Northwest, not so much in California where I am, but all the states surrounding it have a lot of states' rights conflicts going on, so it's fascinating to see that. But specifically in regards to stakeholders, while there's always individual ones based on that individual conflict, there are some overarching ones that fit regardless of the area that it's taking place in. There's the urban versus rural, which we have seen in many of the case studies we've looked at that have strong characterization shifts and frameworks working against them. There's those that are involved in agriculture and hunting versus the ones that our biologists want to conserve and preserve, and there is a strong lack of communication between those. So with that in mind, with all the different stakeholders that come from different federal organizations, for those that work for Fish and Wildlife Services and promote the Endangered Species Act, to those states that feel they don't need it because they can handle it on their own, it sets up for a literal web of conflict. And as I was reading into Mayer's Wheel of Conflict in regards specifically to this, while every category, every part of the wheel could fit really well within it, there were 3 that I noted play a large part. So the first one would be obviously the historical framework, the historical set of conflict. Because it's been going on for so long in so many different areas, there are strong biases and inherent disagreements between these groups, and as they interact together and apart from each other. So it really sets up the whole frame with the structure and the history of it. So from history, I went on and looked at the structure of it to see the dynamics of the conflict, not necessarily the history, but just the way the conflict as a whole is framed together. So that takes into account the opposing view of stakeholders, but it also takes into account the lack of this conflict being tractable because regulations are so different and they are so widely conflicting. So one person may read the regulation as saying one thing, one may read it as saying another, and sorry about that, cat. Sorry. So they may see it as something different completely. And with that, that's one of the things that I've noted in the progress as I'm working through the project, is that there is a strong need for regulations at the state and federal to mean the same thing in regards to how they're being, how they're trying to put them into act when different people feel they mean different things. So with the national parks in general, it's part of the conflict is that they need strong policies developed that mean the same thing as the laws that are actual at the state or federal level. And with that, because of the conflict, there is no way to make that easy. So it really would take these organizations and these different groups of people working together to come up with a compromise. Unfortunately, because of the nature of the people and the groups involved, compromise hasn't come easy. It's been an overriding rule that it's hard for the conservationists and the preservationists to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and even harder for them to work with the ones that are for hunting and agriculture and want those wolves to be gone from their area so they don't have to deal with it. So the things that are going to most likely get to the point where they can help the conflict open up is bringing groups in that are opposed to talk about the regulations and where they're not clear and where they should be more clear. Seeking common ground if it's all possible. Showing relationships that are already forged with groups that wouldn't generally go together. Presenting a strong economic front where a lot of the people that are more concerned about the economy are those that make a living off of the land, and that's the general reasons why they don't want the wolves on their property. So moving past that, getting that common ground, but also rebuilding the framework to being a positive of working with these people instead of a negative. And after that, it's consistent goals, consistent regulation, consistent understanding to try to bring these very opposing worlds into the same view that lines up with the science of the situation. And further with that, with the scientists, the science that they present and the way that they present it needs to be understandable for those that aren't in the scientific realm and often feel alienated. So with the conflict, that's kind of where I'm heading with the strategy, focusing on those stakeholders, how they're the same regardless of which specific conflict it is, how some things have worked for other people in the past with different things, and how some things aren't working well. So seeing in regards to specific conflicts, the ways that you can use an overarching plan to work with it regardless of which national park it is or which national forest or what levels the wolf population is at. Also focusing on how the Fish and Wildlife Service has already tried to get the gray wolves off of the Endangered Species Act because they feel like they're doing well enough. And that particular understanding and their understanding of that situation is that they're good. They don't need any more help. They don't need any more regulating. But from several lawsuits from the Sierra Club and other organizations that were taking to the federal level, said that the Fish and Wildlife Service did not have correct information in stating that, and they were still in a very precarious state with their development. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes, how the strategy works out, and seeing if I see any other frameworks that could shift to make these conflicts easier to solve as a whole. I would love any feedback. As far as my sources go, because of the wide range, I have found journal articles in biological, economic, socioparalogical, and psychological. Different areas that have talked about this conflict and the different ways it's been solved, but also looking at it from the different facets to see how it can all fit into one big picture. Thanks. Bye.